to discuss my analysis of violent video games and its harmful effects and the two different sides that go with it. So, my question, are violent video games harmful to children and adolescents? All right, so of course we have two different sides to our argument. No is going to be the first one that I kind of get into. So one of the premises that I was able to research regarding the effects of violent video games and its harm to children was the neuroscience studies. So violent video games are heavily included in research in neurology. And there are research studies that are able to find a link between violent video games and brain functions, but they do not clearly define what that means. They don't mean that this change could potentially be harmful or even negative. They just kind of acknowledge that there is a change in brain function. I was also able to find an article, and I thought this was really cool, but I was able to find an article, an experimental study that was able to determine that game players who were sustained game players, so they played for a while or a long time, they are able to, or were able to, suppress irrelevant information, and it made it easier for them to complete task-oriented projects. So these researchers, what they were able to do is they were able to form a hypothesis asking if gamers who partake in action play game will have physiological mechanisms in place that will adapt the assignment of visual recognition functions while also increasing efficiency and responsiveness. And to test the hypothesis, they conducted an experiment in 2012 that utilized brain imaging, and they compared the distraction and attention brain processes. And so they were able to find a significant link or a significance, and I thought that was pretty cool. Also, I think that this is a really good point, so I think that it needs to be brought up, but a lot of the evidence regarding this argument is mostly supported by correlational evidence. And correlation cannot determine causation. One of the studies that I found did an experimental research, and at the end of their research and their summary, they really wanted the audience to know that they were not able to account for psychosocial or environmental variables that could have altered their results. It's important to note that whenever you are trying to test for predictive aggressive behaviors within an experimental lab, that variables such as exposure to violence outside of the lab can account for altered perceptions and therefore altered behaviors. Like school bullying, and then come to a lab, that's never really a true experiment because you wouldn't be able to control that. So I thought that's very important. But again, there are always two sides to every argument. So of course we have our yes side. And first of all, just a statistic, 91%, as of 2018, 91% of kids were playing video games. And that statistic is a little astonishing to me. I do understand that times are changing and progressing, but when I was a child, I did not have access to technology. I guess as much as children do these days. So this statistic made me a little bit uncomfortable, specifically in regards to researching this argument side. Yes, and the findings that were produced, 91% of kids that play video games they could may or may not be subjected to these results. So that was a little frightening, just to kind of think about. But what I was able to find is that, yes, exposure to video games escalates aggression in children. And so Anderson and Dill, Craig Anderson and Karen Dill, they were able to find significant links between steady gameplay, so long-term gameplay, and aggressive behaviors. So Craig Anderson specifically, he started doing research after the Columbine shooting, and I was able to find many experimental studies that he had run on violent video games and the effect of effect of aggressive behaviors. But they, Craig Anderson and Karen Dill, were able to test these long-term effects by getting college students. So college students who were able to have played for years and years. That's specifically why they chose this age range of participants. So they were able to get these college students to use self-report questionnaires pertaining to long-term video gameplay, and they were able to analyze these results and did find that aggressive behaviors were linked to steady gameplay. Yikes. Also, 90% of popular gameplays, 90% of popular games do portray violence in some sort of fashion. So the subjection of simulated violence increases the probability of violent behavior replication. There was a study conducted where participants took 15 minutes of gameplay and then were given a questionnaire. So the questionnaire just leveled aggression on a 5-point Likert scale. The participants then played the game for a second time. After 15 minutes, they were stopped. They then took part in a computer program assessment that measured aggressive thinking. So after 1 week of the first stage in the experiment, the participants returned to the facility and again played the game just to kind of replicate the study. And there was an increase in aggressive thinking after the 15 minutes of gameplay. So I thought that was a pretty cool way of conducting the experiment, just to kind of cut out some of the variables and to create a more specific link between aggressive behaviors and violent video games. So, in this argument, it does heavily use correlated variables as evidence for the claim. And that's gonna definitely decrease your validity. So you want to have experimental research, and you want to be able to take those results, and you do want to be able to specifically say, yes, this is the cause. So that way it doesn't leave room for misinterpretation. Another thing that I was able to kind of find was, sources providing evidence supporting topics they weren't kind of up to date. So I would have liked to find sources that were relatively closer to 2020, and I was finding more credible sources that were closer to the Columbine shooting. It seemed as if they were right after the 2000 shooting. And the reason that the late 1990s shooting, the reason I chose these sources is because of the amounts of times that they were cited. I didn't want to pick sources that were closer to 2020, but that hadn't been peer-reviewed or even cited too much. So no, let's get into the validity of the no argument. No, video games are not harmful to youth. So this argument produces low internal validity because the variables such as emotional distress, anxieties, exposure to violent video games, these were not addressed in some of the studies that were talking about harm. So this kind of narrows the scope. Or change anything in the future, I would just make sure that I have a better definition. thank you for listening. I really appreciate it.